Save this video now. You guys asked for inverse function, so let's run it today. If you didn't already, go check out part 1 where we looked at the concept of a function. So just a quick recap. What is a function? A function is like a machine. It takes in a value for x, the function does something to it, and it gives you an output. Here's a quick example. If you had a function f of x is equal to 9x plus 3, this function just tells you whatever you put in into the function will be multiplied by 9 and you add 3 to it. Say for instance you plugged 1 into the function. You replace x with 1, 9 by 1 plus 3, 9 plus 3 is 12. So you plugged in 1 into the function and you got an output of 12. So that's what a function does. A function takes in an input x and it gives you an output y. So the original function maps x to y. Cool. Now what do you think the inverse function would do? Well, it just do the opposite. You know, inverse kinda sounds like opposite. So if f of x maps x to y, then the inverse function is going to map y to x. So the mapping is reversed. So you already know, if you come into Math Vibes, you're coming for the in-depth explanations. You're not just coming to memorize some steps. So let's understand the reason behind all the steps you would learn in school. Your first step, you're going to replace f of x with y. Now why are you doing this? What if I told you, yes you, that f of x and y mean the same thing? Both of them mean the output of the function. Now it's just simpler to work with y. So instead of writing f of x as the output, you could just write y. So the first step is to replace f of x with y, just to make your life simpler. Then the next step, you're going to swap x and y. I wonder why we just do this, boy. I wonder. Well, if you notice, the inverse function just has the reverse mapping of the original function. So instead of going from x to y, you're going from y to x. So you need to swap x and y. Again, the inverse function reverses input and output. So look, the original function was mapping x onto y. But the inverse function is going to map y onto x. So you need to swap x and y when you're finding the inverse function. I hope it makes sense. You're swapping it because the mapping is reversed. The next step, you need to make y the subject of the formula. But why are you doing that? Let me explain. In all functions, right? Here what? I just gotta replace f of x with y. We know it means the same thing. Look at this function. Isn't this function telling me what y is equal to in terms of x? If you can't see it, watch. It literally says y is equal to 9x plus 3. Okay, what about this function over here? Well, this function literally says y is equal to 2x. It could replace g of x for y. We know it means the output. So all of these functions, what's the subject of the formula? You tell me. Well, the subject of the formula is y. So when you're writing a function, one of the unknowns needs to be the subject of the formula. That is the whole concept of a function. So y would be equal to 9x plus 3. Y would be equal to 2x. So if you're trying to find the inverse function, you would need to make y the subject of the formula. Because remember, y is going to be equal to you doing something to x. That's the whole concept of a function. Watch. Over here for this function, it was multiplying the input by 9 and adding 3 to it. Over here, it was multiplying the input by 2. So this is the whole concept of functions. The next step, you have to rename y to f inverse x. So after you've replaced f of x with y, you've swapped x and y, and you've made y the subject. Now, here what you could do. You could change y to the inverse function notation, because you would have just found the inverse function. So let's run through these steps one more time. So why are you replacing f of x with y? Why are you doing this? You're doing this to make your life simpler. F of x and y mean the same thing. It means the output. Hope we understand that. Then you're going to swap. Why are you swapping? You're swapping because the inverse function reverses the mapping. Then you're going to solve. You're going to make y the subject of the formula. You're doing this because any function tells you what one thing is in terms of the other thing. So in this case, it'd be y is equal in terms of x. Y would be in terms of x. And then your last step is to rename. So you're going to rename y and you're going to write it as the inverse function notation, and that's the whole gist of it. Replace, swap, solve, rename. Simple. So let's look at a question now. We have g of x is equal to 2x. This should look familiar if you watched part 1. And they want us to find the inverse function for x. So to understand this, I've made a mapping diagram here. So I have values for x here in the domain, and I have values for y here in the range. Now the function will map elements in the domain to exactly one element in the range. And if you're confused, watch. When x is 1, I'm going to replace x with 1. 2 by 1 is 2. So when x is 1, my output is 2. When x is 2, 2 by 2 is 4, my output is 4. So when x is 1, I get an output of 2. When x is 2, I get an output of 4. And that is what the function is doing. It's mapping the x value onto the y value. So again, what do you think the inverse function would do? Well, the inverse function, it should map 2 onto 1, and it should map 4 onto 2. So let's go ahead and find the inverse function and then see if it works. So what was our steps? Our steps was to replace. So we are going to replace g of x here with y, because we know that represents the output. So we'll say y is equal to 2x. Then the next step was to swap x and y, because the inverse function has a reverse mapping. So you'll say x is equal to 2y, so reverse x and y. And the next step is to solve. You want to make y the subject of the formula. So over here we have x is equal to 2y. So we're trying to make y the subject of the formula. So if you're multiplying y by 2 and you want to get rid of the 2, you'd have to do the opposite, which would be to divide both sides by 2. Remember, it's an equation. So whatever you do on one side, you have to do on the other side. So the 2 and the 2 is going to cancel off. Yippee! And so y is going to be equal to x over 2 now. So y is equal to x over 2. Now, the last step, we're going to replace y with the inverse function notation. So I'm going to rewrite y for g inverse x. You're probably saying, sir, how any of this making sense? Let's stay with me, right? Stay with me. So at the start, I said that the inverse function, it maps y onto x. It just does the opposite, you know. So let's see if that is true. So I got the inverse function x over 2. Now, like I said, the inverse function is you're plugging in the y values, which we're treating as the x values. Because if we're using the y values are now going to become the domain. So it might seem a bit confusing, but it's really simple. Let me show you something. So we found g inverse x to be x over 2. So my question is, if I were to plug 2 into the inverse function, what am I supposed to get? Well, I am supposed to get 1. Let me see if that would work out. Boom! Watch, we get 1. When I plug 4 into the inverse function, what do you think I'm supposed to get? Well, I'm supposed to get 2, so let's give it a go. So g inverse are 4. So I'm going to say 4 over 2, because that was my inverse function, right? My inverse function was just dividing the input by 2. So 4 over 2 is just 2, right? So you see, let's do a quick review again. So the inverse function, it just does the opposite. It maps the output onto the input. And so if I plug in 2 into the inverse function, I'm supposed to get 1. When I plug in 4 into the inverse function, I'm supposed to get 2. And you can see it works. Because if I put 2 into the inverse function, I say 2 over 2, I get back 1. When I plug 4 into the inverse function, what do I get back? I get back 2. So that's the whole concept of the inverse function. It just does the opposite mapping. It carries you from y to x. Cool. And the general steps were, you're going to replace g of x with y. You're going to swap x and y. You're going to make y the subject of the formula. And then the last step is to replace y with the inverse function notation. Now, I hope you guys have some sort of appreciation for these steps now. Let's do a harder problem. So we have f of x is equal to 9x plus 3. And we want to find the inverse function. So the first step, we're going to replace f of x with what, guys? With y. Because both of them represent the output, but it's just easier to work with y. So we'll say y is equal to 9x plus 3. What is the next step? The next step is to swap x and y. So we'll say x is equal to 9y plus 3. The next step, you have to solve for y. You have to make y the subject of the formula. So if we want to make y the subject of the formula, we need to isolate y. Y needs to be the only term on this side. So you see this 3 over here? This 3 does not belong here because it doesn't have any relationship with y. When we look at the right-hand side, are you seeing a y by the 3? No, you're not. So the 3 does not belong there. So what you could do is, you could move across the 3 on the left-hand side. Or, some students may learn it as taking away 3 on both sides. Both are fine. So if I move across the 3, I'll get x minus 3 is equal to 9y. Or simply, you could think of it as taking away 3 on both sides. Because if you take away 3 on both sides, the 3 and the minus 3 are going to cancel off. So it will just leave you with 9y. So we have x minus 3 is equal to 9y. And now we very, very close to our answer. We want to find for y. But right now we have 9 times y. So if you want to find for y, you'd have to divide both sides by 9. And why are we doing this? We're doing this because the 9 and 9 would cancel off to just give us y. So y would just be equal to x minus 3 all over 9. And what is y? Remember, y is the inverse function. We've just found for the inverse function. So f inverse x is going to be equal to x minus 3 all over 9. And this function is supposed to map y onto x. So let's give it a go. So, question. If I plug 12 into the inverse function, what do you think I'm supposed to get? Well, according to the mapping, I'm supposed to get 1. So let me see now. Let me see if that's true. So I'm plugging in 12 into my inverse function. So if I'm plugging in 12, then I'm going to replace x with 12. So that's going to be 12 minus 3 over 9. 12 minus 3 is 9. What is 9 over 9? 9 over 9 is 1. Watch. We got back 1. Let's go. And I have another question for you. If I were to plug in 21 into the inverse function, what do you think I'll get? Well, I'll just get back 2. And if you don't believe me, let's do some quick proof. So again, the inverse function was x minus 3 over 9. And we are putting in 21 into that. So that's going to be 21 minus 3 over 9. 21 minus 3 was 21 minus 3. 21 minus 3 is 18. So 18 over 9. Where's 18 over 9? 18 over 9 is 2. Let's go. So I hope you guys understand the concept of the inverse function. It just maps y onto x. It just reverses the function. So I hope that was insightful. Remember, these are the steps. Replace, swap, solve, rename. Cool. Later, guys.